Hello and welcome to the first ever episode of the SKaffeehaus, a podcast brought to you by the Baroque music collective Solomon's Knot. I'm artistic director Jonny Sells, and this is a place where we will chat to interesting people, get geeky about old music, explore the ideas behind upcoming projects, and discuss news and trends in the classical music world. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and tell all your friends. You can sign up for our newsletter at solomonsnotcollective.com to keep up to date with what we're doing next. So, hello. Hello and welcome to Professor Stephen Rose, our first guest in the SKaffeehaus. Hi, Stephen. Where are you?
Hi, it's great to be with you, and I'm in London today.
Excellent. And Jan is also here. Jan, our bass player.
Just got back from the States yesterday.
Great. So you're all tested up.
Yeah. Well, I just went and got my test, my day two on day one test.
Good luck. Because we're rehearsing on Monday, so it better be negative. Stephen is Professor of Music at Royal Holloway, University of London. And I first met him too long ago to really mention here, when he taught me a lot about Bach at university. And I'm really pleased that you've managed to find some time in your very busy schedule, Stephen. Thank you so much for coming to chat to us today about our upcoming project, which is, as I said, starting in just a few days' time. We start rehearsing on Monday, and we are performing 3 cantatas by Bach, and the program is called Not the Christmas Oratorio. We're playing at Wigmore Hall on the 10th of September, at the Newbury Festival on the 17th of September, in the church where Bach was baptized, standing around his baptismal font in the Georgenkirche in Eisenach on the 15th of September, which is extremely exciting.
Amazing.
We're going to have to kind of pull ourselves together in order to be able to sing and play properly, I think. And then on the 9th of October in Regensburg as well. And Stephen's latest book, which I really want to tell everyone about, is called... Stephen, introduce your most recent book.
Yeah, it's called Musical Authorship from Schütz to Bach. And it's looking basically at what did it mean to be a composer in 17th century Germany or early 18th century Germany. What were the ideas of creativity? Did they think that they were just an agent for God, God-given talents, or were they using things within them, their own kind of skills, their own invention? Did they see themselves like craft workers, kind of working their hands on the organ, converting that into compositions? Or was it more a brain job, thinking through music in your head and then writing it down? And how did they use music of the past, and how did they adapt it, and how did they make it their own, and what made a piece of music individual and gave it a sense of individual style? So it's kind of talking about those sort of questions of individuality and ownership in music.
What's it called again, the title of the book? Musical
Authorship from Schütz to Bach.
Beautiful.
Cambridge University Press. Get your copy now. Now I know that you don't touch specifically on the parody process very much in that book, but all of those things that you've just mentioned are so relevant to this program that we're talking about. And I should explain in more detail what it actually is. So Not the Christmas Oratorio is the 3 cantatas, and if you're into your BWV numbers, they are 213, 214, and 215, which is nice and easy to remember. All of which contain music which reappeared in the Christmas Oratorio. And this all occurred within quite a short space of time. So these cantatas were written in 1733 and 1734, and the Christmas Oratorio was put together for Christmas and the following festivals in 1734. But these cantatas were not written for the church. Steve, I don't know whether you want to go through what these cantatas are about. Otherwise, I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, it's really interesting because it's such an alien concept nowadays to us. And nowadays we think of Bach as being mainly writing sacred music, church cantatas, passions, so forth. But these cantatas were actually offered as one-off performances to members of the Saxon royal family who were, celebrating their birthday, or on one occasion they were visiting Leipzig, but generally they were performed actually not with the recipients' presence. For the members of the royal family who were in Dresden, 75 miles away, and Bach was there in Leipzig with a band of students, the so-called Collegium Musicum, performing something for the birthday of the Queen of Saxony or a Crown Prince or whatever. And the whole idea was, they were showing how loyal they were, and they would probably send a printed copy of the words down to Dresden so they could see what had happened. But the whole idea behind these performances, they were meant to be one-off, because if you were as important as the monarch or the Elector of Saxony, you didn't expect things to be reused for you. You expected them to be new and, done specially for you, and then to be discarded. So it was a kind of conspicuous consumption. Here's a cantata, I'll use it once and never again. Or I'm not actually going to be present for the performance, but it still shows how important I am for it to be performed. But then Bach went against that code by reusing them for the Christmas Oratorio.
Yeah, there's a lot of parallels with recycling nowadays. But I don't want to degrade the music of Bach to a piece of throwaway plastic or anything like that. But I think it's good. I'd really like to talk about the original context of these pieces before we go on to looking at the links with the Christmas Oratorio, because there's so much interesting stuff in there to do with their context. And on that concept of something which could just be thrown away, I was just reading Alfred Durr's book on the cantatas, and he says it's as if the quality of the music is so good in the case of one of them, and arguably better than the quality of the poetry which was written for the occasion, which of course is, well, we would nowadays say fairly sycophantic, but one can understand why, of course. That it's as if Bach was on a polite visit, but instead of bringing a bunch of flowers, he brought the crown jewels with him. And in that, as you say, that sort of consumption, but consuming something in theory for a one-off occasion, which was just of extremely high quality, of course, which explains therefore why Bach decided to, or had perhaps already planned to use this music again in a religious context, which meant that it could be then performed every year forever and ever and ever, which indeed it more or less has been. But the interesting thing about these pieces as well, and also there are a couple of links here to the B minor Mass, is that Bach was sort of looking for a job, or at least looking for a title. Can you tell us a bit more about that, Stephen?
Yeah, so Bach at this stage was in Leipzig, where he had arrived in 1723, and he had two jobs there. One is as basically school music teacher at the Thomasschule, or cantor, and that job carried with it also the role of city music director, so responsible for the music in the city's churches and providing a cantata and other types of music. And in the first years that he was in that job, so in the mid-1720s, he really seems to have been, thrown himself into it. He was writing a cantata almost every week. He was writing works like the St. Matthew Passion and the St. John Passion, which obviously, massive, unparalleled sacred works. Nothing of that length or expression had been previously written. But by about 1730, he was feeling really disillusioned with the situation in Leipzig, and he had fallen out with the town council, which was complaining that he wasn't paying enough attention to his teaching duties, and he was complaining that the town council wasn't giving him enough resources, enough good quality performers to do what he wanted to do.
He'd written his famous Entwurf by this stage, is that right?
Yes, so in 1730 he wrote the Entwurf, which is a sort of proposal to how to make church music better, and it's been argued about a lot by scholars and performers in the 20th century, because he says he wants to have at least 16 singers in his choir, and people have argued about whether that should be, that means 4 voices per part, or were these people to be singing in other choirs, or were they sort of reserved voices in case people were sick? So we won't go down into that rabbit hole.
No, that kind of worms is firmly closed today. Suffice to say that we'll be performing these cantatas with 8 singers. Full stop.
But I think the fact that he was writing this sort of thing indicates that he was unhappy. He wanted more that the town council wasn't giving him. And so in the 1730s, he seems to have decided to really change course in his career, and was less interested in sacred music. And he was instead giving concerts in the city's coffee houses with the Collegium Musicum, this ensemble of students. And then he was looking to the court in Dresden for further opportunities. So as I said, that is about 75 miles away. So that was actually quite a long journey to make in the days of horse-drawn carriages. But in 1733, he sent the Dresden court the first 2 movements of what we now know as the B minor Mass, so the Kyrie and the Gloria. And then he starts in Leipzig performing these cantatas, the ones you're going to be performing. So marking when there's a birthday or a sort of significant day in the Saxon royal family, marking that. And eventually, he applies, I think in 1736, for the title of Royal Court Composer, and he does get that. So he does seem to be, it seems to have been a sort of long-term campaign to kind of get a foothold in the Dresden court, although he remained based in Leipzig, and that was, where he got his income from. And the post in Dresden seems to have been just a sort of honorary title.
Yeah, I get the impression it was sort of CV points, wasn't it? And something that he, something he could then use to show the Leipzig authorities, I'm much more, regionally appreciated here, and you should really give me what I want, because I'm actually a very important person, Even though I've been here for a while, I'm still doing my professional development. I'm still getting better.
I think so, definitely, yeah, because I think he felt taken for granted by the town council, and also by the school, because there was a change of headmaster at the school, and new headmaster came in who wasn't as sympathetic to music. So, familiar situation for many school teachers, having to deal with employers who don't fully appreciate what you're trying to do.
I'm glad you mentioned the coffee houses around Leipzig, because of course our cafe house, which originally started as a lockdown project, a sort of live Zoom meeting, is based in honor of Zimmermann's cafe house in Leipzig, where I think all 3 of these cantatas were performed originally. But I first would really like to talk more specifically about BWV 215 and its historical context, because there's another element here around 1733, which is this big change of king, or the elector changed, because August the Strong died in early 1733, and then the succession was not entirely straightforward to August III, as he became. The other 2 cantatas are allegorical and more sort of generally praising. You've got the young 11-year-old prince being compared to Hercules, which is fun. and and for the Queen's birthday, some different gods and goddesses coming to praise her various attributes. But in Preise dein Glücke, gesegnetes Sachsen, there's a lot of action, which is really, really exciting. And apart from the fact that it opens with the movement which then later became the Hosanna in the B minor Mass, which is another kind of added bonus to the Christmas Oratorio aspect of things. There's a lot of war because, as I understand it, the August III didn't automatically become King of Poland. His father had been King of Poland, but when he tried to foist that onto the Poles and also the French, who wanted to annoy the Habsburgs by not letting them get their crown of Poland, there was a huge fight. Basically, there was the War of the Polish Succession and the siege of Danzig. And I really want to get Michał, our Polish countertenor, who's singing Hercules in the other cantata. I want to get him to sit down and chat to us about how he feels about that whole historical thing, because I had an interesting exchange with him and about the fact that he felt that whoever it was, the senators at that time who were choosing the king, had kind of sold Poland down the river by letting the Saxon royal family keep their crown. And there was Stanisław Leszczyński, who was defending or wanted the Polish title for himself, and there was this enormous battle. So it's a great chance for the trumpets and the drums to get kicking off in that cantata, and there's specific references to Danzig and the whole sort of Russia-Polish region in that cantata, which gives it a bit more sort of concrete action, and a specific reason to celebrate August's, not only his prowess in war, but actually also his clemency afterwards and all that kind of thing. So there's a lot to get one's teeth into in that cantata, which is.
And they're some quite unusual, some of the arias are quite unusual. I think some of the arias that he didn't reuse, there's one which is sort of very battle-like with a kind of buzzing sort of string line, and then one which is all about Augustus's mercy, which doesn't have a continuo part, and it's this very unusual sort of floating texture.
Yeah, that's right. The bass aria, which I'm going to be singing, Rase nur verwegener Schwarm. It doesn't sound anything like Bach to me, really. It's something straight out of a Handel or even a Telemann opera, and actually we're used to hearing the occasional aria from a sacred cantata that sounds like it's sort of straight off the operatic stage. There's another sort of blurring there as well, but this one is that one's really great fun. And the other one you mentioned is what becomes the bass aria in cantata number 5 in the Christmas Oratorio, Leucht auch meine finstere Sinnen. But
I recognized it, but I can't remember which one it is.
And in Christmas Oratorio, it's for bass. Here, it's for soprano in a different key, obviously, and no bass line, which sort of again shows that link with the king and his sort of otherworldly qualities, the fact that his mercy is unearthly, as it were. So, Stephen, maybe you can take us through some of the ways in which this music ends up then in the Christmas Oratorio.
Yeah, so the term is parody, not parody as in a distortion for comical effects, but parody as in changing the words or updating the words. And we have that email exchange, Jonny, where you said it's a bit like a cover version or a cover song. Well, in some ways, I mean, it would be like one where the words are sort of changed or updated. But yeah, it is this kind of updating, maybe not updating, but changing the words to sacred words. And as you say, that tells us really interesting things about the relationship of something which was originally very secular to the sacred, but also things about how Bach connected text and music. because in a Baroque aria, the opening normally suggests certain texts or emotions. So we've just talked about those two arias in Cantata 215, one which is really like a sort of Handel rage aria with a kind of repeated notes, a sort of rather violent kind of violin, sort of martial noises of war. So if you have that sort of opening, you start to think of certain texts immediately. And when you then put it with a particular text, that kind of music and the text, they make that unique combination, and you start to hear the music in light of the words, and you think about the words in light of the music. But sometimes, and you see this when he starts adapting things to the Christmas Oratorio, you can see how the same music can support a very different text. And I think actually the Hercules cantata has some of the best examples in it. So Jonny, you said this is a cantata for the young prince, and it's sort of describing him as Hercules, and should he choose the way of pleasure or the way of virtue. So it starts with a lovely chorus. And the text is Lasst uns sorgen, so let us care for him, and it's got these sort of stroking figures in it. And then in the Christmas Oratorio, that becomes the start, I think, of Christmas Oratorio number 4. So it's saying we need to kneel before the infant Christ. So it's very similar. It's this kind of gentle, caressing kind of, we've got this precious boy in front of us. But then there are other ones which are more complicated, and the really famous example is the first aria in the same cantata, which is when the allegorical figure of pleasure tries to seduce Hercules, and she says basically, sleep my beloved and taste the delights coming from my breast, and it's all quite flirtatious and saucy. And then for the Christmas Oratorio, this becomes the Virgin Mary singing to the infant Jesus a kind of lullaby, and it becomes sleep. I mean, again, the opening lines are the same, sleep my beloved, but then it's the kind of maternal embrace rather than that of a lover.
What would Freud say?
Bach does make some changes, because I think he puts it in a lower key and he adds an oboe. So this starts to suggest a sort of different texture and a different timbre and a different tempo. But fundamentally, it's the same harmonies, the same sort of figures, and it's kind of like almost you can put his music in lots of different contexts and it still makes sense.
I think the breasts are the link there. The mother's breast, or the or the allegorical figure of pleasure. I mean, I was reading on the Baroque concept, this concept of Lust, or Wollust, as she's called in the cantata, because there was a very strong distinction in this period between earthly lust and spiritual lust, as it were. This word lust, which comes up a lot in the cantatas, in the sacred ones as well, in different contexts. Lust can just mean delight, pleasure, in an innocent sense, or purely in the sense of joy, and even Wollust. I was curious to see exactly how it's treated in this cantata, because actually in the story of Hercules and the choice of Hercules, it doesn't have to be specifically sensual. It can also be just a choice between essentially a lazy life and a virtuous but hard-working life.
It sounds like the lusty in English. Where
right, yeah.
Lusty doesn't mean anything to do with sex at all, does it? It's like vigorous almost, right?
Yeah, but this figure of lust is also the opposite of that. And she's saying sleep in the aria, right? So there's a big ambiguity here, but the text itself is actually pretty suggestive, as you say. Is she asking him just to take the easy way out and and lounge around all day, or is there more to it there?
And you might want to put it in the context of Leipzig, which is a Protestant trading city, so it has the sort of Protestant work ethic. So, you know, obviously this idea of a prince lazing around, it might be the courtly lifestyle, but in Leipzig that would have seemed kind of, you know, not the right thing to do. You had to be industrious, you know, build progress. So I think it is sort of, it is kind of moralizing on what are the choices for a young prince. So in a way, it is quite serious. You know, should he be, you know, a man of leisure going on the grand tour and just pleasuring himself with all the fine things of the world, or should he apply himself to, you know, virtuous pursuits of learning, religious edification? So it is almost a commentary on educational choices, to make it sound very boring, as well as on, you know, a young man discovering himself.
But would Bach have been addressing that to the prince or to like his parents? Because that's, if he's addressing that to the prince, that's pretty hardcore to be like, you know, you gotta do you know what I'm saying, to like start lecturing the
Yes.
prince if he's looking for a job opportunity, you know.
And particularly because almost there's a double audience of this. So there are people in Leipzig who are watching it, potentially including Bach's employers,
Right.
you know, seeing Bach in this kind of remote act of homage to Dresden. And Dresden will probably only hear of this at second hand.
Right.
So maybe there was a bit of sort of flexibility.
Interesting.
But yeah, it would be politically difficult, wouldn't it? I mean, if that was actually being performed in front of a prince. But some of the later movements are quite clever, because there's this echo aria where basically Hercules is saying, well, what should I do? Should I do this? Yes, I will. And the echo says, yes, you should. And so the echo is like this disembodied godly voice directing him, and you know, old Baroque device when you need that kind of
right.
otherworldly figure to tell you what to do.
Right.
That exactly that point you make is that that's the aria where that political danger is avoided, because Hercules is specifically given the words to tell the echo what to tell him. So he says, I'm not going to follow last, am I? Echo, you've got to say no, and then the echo says no. So, like, you know, to insinuate that there might have been any kind of wavering in the mind of Hercules is sort of avoided there.
Well, and also if the prince is going to just hear about this, but not hear any of the details, also because he's the prince, what does he care, right? So, but he's going to hear that there's been this event, and he's going to be like, awesome, they were singing about me, that's amazing. But meanwhile in Leipzig, they're like, did you hear what they were saying about the prince? That's amazing. Put him in his place. That's crazy.
He chooses.
I mean, it may be,
of course.
Perhaps wasn't as subversive as that, but I really like, Jonny, your interpretation of the echo aria, because that is exactly the dilemma of the Baroque poet or the Baroque composer or the poet laureate nowadays. You know, how do we say things to authority?
Right.
And you almost have to be this mouthpiece of them, but also have to pretend to be your own artistic personality.
Yeah, he says, "Gib mir deine Antwort, nein." You know, he tells him what to say. And of course, echo being an echo, I don't. You know, you can't blame the echo, can you? Just going back to what you said about this whole prima la musica, poi le parole. You know, that we like to think of inspired composers going for a long walk with the poem in their hand, and then the perfect music which fits those words comes into their minds, and they form a sort of holy union together. And of course, this process shows that it doesn't have to be like that. But you know, the most interesting example of that for me is the opening movement of Tönet ihr Pauken, which becomes Jauchzet frohlocket, which we're all very familiar with. you can't argue with the fact that the original text fits this music better. I mean, it's completely primary colors. Sound ye drums, and then the drums play. Blow ye trumpets, and then the trumpets play, and then they talk about the strings, and the strings play. And there's this awkward thing for all of those people who've sung Jauchzet, Frohlocket. Jauchzet, Frohlocket, auf, preiset die Tage is the text, right? So they say, be joyful, rejoice, get up and praise the day. And this auf needs to have its own space in a way. It's Jauchzet, Frohlocket, auf, preiset die Tage, get up and praise the day. And it's awkward in the way that it's set in the Christmas Oratorio because it's an upbeat and it's very easy to just sing Aufpreiset die Tage as if Aufpreiset was some kind of word. But actually, when we do the Christmas Oratorio, we have to make a big effort to sing Aufpreiset die Tage and make as much of a sort of exclamation mark gap between those two words as we can. Whereas in this version, where we're just singing Erschallet Trompeten, it makes a lot more sense. And yeah, for me, it's just an example of how a text that's really absolutely one-to-one with the music can still be changed and become such an iconic piece of music that for every single German-speaking person is the epitome of what Christmas is all about. Okay, maybe not every single one, but so many. And yeah, perhaps then going back to your point, the point that you talk about in your book, in your new book, Stephen, about is composing, sort of channeling the divine, and that, or what are the different aspects of being creative, and here, of course, we have a lot of parallels and a lot of ambiguity between what is worldly and what is holy, what belongs in the church. And we're performing these pieces in a couple of churches, which, strictly speaking, is another bastardization of the context in a way, because these would have been performed possibly outside, well, in some cases certainly outside, and these royal figures would have also been, at the same time, they would have been seen as fulfilling God's duty on earth. And so on the other hand, you say, well, this is a cantata for a royal birthday, and the first cantata of Christmas Oratorio is just another cantata for a royal birthday, but for a heavenly king, but this king happens to be on earth, but it has the blessing of God or whatever, is carrying out the will of God.
Yeah, absolutely. So the king is seen as God's representative on earth, and for Bach, there wouldn't be any kind of disjunction in using the same music for a queen one day and then for God the next, and the sort of musical signs are the same. You have trumpets, you have drums, and yes, as you say, Eternity Pauken is very specific references to those particular instruments, which it's almost like a Purcell St. Cecilia Day ode. Hear all the instruments of the orchestra singing praise, and that in a sacred context, you don't want to be that specific about the drums are singing praise to God, and you just want that general jubilation. But I think Bach would have seen no incongruity in this, as opposed to 19th century writers on Bach who were actually really shocked when they discovered this. So Philipp Spitta, who wrote one of the first biographies of Bach, the sort of first kind of scholarly biography, I think in the 1870s, he was really quite shocked. And he said that when you find out about these kind of secular origins, he said it really spoils it and, takes away the pleasure of those movements. And I don't think that's the case anymore, because, maybe we've lost that sense of kind of separation that he had between the 19th century sort of separation between church and the secular worlds, and now we're just in the more secular worlds where this is, Bach's music is one of many musics, and we're much more casual about those boundaries. And I think Bach would have also been casual about
that's what I was going to ask you, is if in Bach's time it was kind of a similar situation, but from the other direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And the world of the king was God's world, but also devout Lutherans, and Bach was probably one, they would see something of the sacred in everything they did, because they believed that musical talents as a performer or as a composer, they believed that was given to them by God. And Bach's predecessor in Leipzig, Johann Kuhnau, actually said that if you don't constantly thank God for your talents, and if you don't, try and use them in a virtuous way, God will become jealous and will take your talents away and leave you kind of useless and unable to look after yourself and have a profession. So there was a real sense that in everything they did, God was part of that, but it was just a completely different sense that the kind of sacred and the secular was so intertwined in a way that's kind of unimaginable to us, given the way that, religion permeated every part of people's lives.
Although having said
that,
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in the same way that nowadays, I don't know if atheism is the right word, but this kind of general sense that religion isn't as important. Although, I just got back from the United States, and it's not just in the United States, but religion still is really, really, really strong, even in the West. But it's really interesting, this kind of noticing the transition in that writer from the 19th century. Very interesting.
And also the fact that, despite the fact we live in a much more secular world nowadays, these secular vocal works of Bach are still almost completely unknown. The coffee cantata people might have heard of, if not actually heard. But these pieces, for example, it's actually quite difficult to get hold of the performance material for BWV 215. There isn't, as far as I know, a published edition of it, and certainly, or not of the parts. And although, of course, a lot of the music's extremely familiar, there are also a lot of really good arias and that aren't, and it's good stuff. It should be heard. It must be heard. There's one other thing that I'm really curious about, or that's fascinating to see when you look in detail at this music, which is a facet of Bach's music, which of course we see when he revised pieces that he reused, like the Big Passions, the ones that we're most familiar with, come in various different versions. And it seems that Bach was never anyone who was content just to pick up a piece he wrote 10 years ago and perform it in the same way. He, even from the first early versions of the John Passion, we did the 1725 version of the John Passion a couple of years ago, and you've got the first 10 movements, which are in a slightly earlier version than the later ones we know now, and just so many small details, little changes in the harmonization of the chorales, details in the recitative. He's always tinkering, he's always improving, and sometimes he'll add a couple of extra parts in because it wasn't quite contrapuntal enough for him, or whatever it might be. And you see that here in lots of really interesting examples. One of them, for example, the B section in the middle of the first movement of Preise dein Glücke, the one that becomes the Hosanna, Hosanna. There's a kind of okay B section in it, which maybe one of his students wrote. No, maybe not. Or one of his sons, I don't know. But, that was dropped. There are everywhere. I mean, we've been memorizing this music. All the singers are singing from memory, so you get to know it intimately, and whatever you've memorized before is already burned in your brain. So we've done some of the Christmas Oratorio before, and you just see, well, yeah, it's the same line, but he just decided to decorate this bit with semiquavers, or.
So I think even the continual line, the very first utterance is different between the two. I think it's a series of semiquavers, or the smaller than the semiquaver. What have you? 64th notes.
Yeah, semis. Yeah,
I think.
It's the
and I don't. In the Christmas Oratorio, I think it's just a quaver,
an upbeat. Yeah.
I think so.
Everywhere, and you just sort of marveling at this constant improvement process where it would have been so easy to just copy and paste.
But if you look at Handel, although Handel's a very different type of composer, but Handel is always likewise changing things, maybe less with an aim of ultimate improvement and more with, here's another context for which I have to adapt things. So I think it was as much adapting as, necessarily wanting to improve. But change, every time a composer will write something down, they will normally change the details, and whether that's because they see it's in a different way, or they're doing it for different types of performers, and want to use those different people's skills or different types of instruments. Maybe it's a different size of organ playing continuo, so you make changes. So these pieces are always changing, I think, in the minds of the composers.
Those changes are there are some of those very obvious changes, like changes of voice type. The obligato lines would be played by a different instrument, sometimes just because it's a change of key and a different instrument works better, or small things like the grosse Herr, the trumpet aria from cantata number 1, which in 214 doesn't have a flute doubling the first violin part. Why? Who knows? Bach just thought, I need that extra something for the dedication to Jesus. On your point earlier about all music being written to God, as it were, and an execution of one's godly talents, it just occurred to me, did Bach also write SDG at the end of Soli Deo Gloria at the end of these secular cantatas? So I just went to have a look at the end of one of the manuscripts of one of them, and I'm fairly sure that
yes, that looks like SDG or DSG. So obviously Latin, you can put them in the words in different order and they still mean the same. So that's interesting. So these Soli Deo Gloria things, they're really interesting because you tend to find them on the composing score, so the full score, not on the individual parts. And it's like, I've got to this point of finishing, and this is my kind of overview of the whole composition, and I don't want to be really boastful and put my own name on it. I'm going to thank God, like a kind of insurance policy, in case he takes away my talents if I appear too boastful and say, it's just JSB. I'll put SDG there as well. But you often find these on the full scores. It's really interesting, on the thing that give a kind of overview of the whole composition, and that's true for other composers as well, like Handel or Buxtehude, and you don't see it on the performing parts. So that seemed to have different connotations. It's used in very specific places, but yes, he's sort of giving thanks to God for being able to have composed it, and often having composed it in very short amount of time, because I think one of the cantatas, is Eternity Pauken, it's dated the day before the performance, so he was kind of finishing at the last minute.
I think, well, certainly for Preise dein Glücke, the king told Leipzig he was coming with 3 days' notice, and the whole thing was written within 3 days and rehearsed not very much, I should think. Which again, considering that I assume that there is quite a lot of original music in it. Of course, in some of these cantatas as well, there are movements that were inherited from previous works. But it is quite astonishing to imagine at what speed this was created. And that of course, is the cantata which has the excellent, if rather tragic, anecdote about the first trumpeter keeling over the next day, because there was a torchlit procession up to the balcony where the royals were, and the next day Gottfried Reicher, Bach's absolute number one trumpeter who was playing these extremely high-flying lines. Had a stroke.
Oh God!
Apparently, because of the strenuous playing, but also because of the thick smoke from all the torches. So we'll be more careful in our performances.
But that was very much the 18th century spirit. The king is coming, you just have to drop everything. And it's a sign of the importance that, they can do these visits at so little notice. And they expect, torchlit processions and
human
newly composed music without any rehearsal and personal sacrifice. And that's just part of the kind of feudal power of making other people suffer while you are incredibly important. So actually, it's quite an unpleasant kind of economy behind these pieces, but still fantastic music.
And Bach got what he wanted in the end. He got his title of court composer, so sorry, Reiche.
Yeah. Gottfried.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. Is there anything else that you wanted to add about these works or about their connections? Or
maybe just one tiny, really interesting thing is that all of them on the scores are called drama in musica or drama per musica. So that's the same term as used for operas. And although people don't normally think of Bach as writing opera, and these pieces obviously aren't really to be done in a theatre, maybe there was something quite theatrical about them. As you mentioned, that sort of processional context for the cantata 215, Preise dein Glücke. That would have been a very kind of theatrical use of the city streets, made almost into an open air theatre, and then they have arias for characters and a sort of dramatic pacing. So maybe they are a sort of taste of what Bach might have been if he had been working as an opera house.
Stephen, are there any other of the Bach works with that drama in musica title?
I think quite a lot of the secular cantatas. I would have to check to be definite, but I think it is only the secular ones, and he doesn't use that term for any of the sacred cantatas.
I feel like I've seen it for sure previously, but
205, for example, is as a drama per musica. I think most of the secular cantatas. It's interesting that he puts that on all three, even though there isn't necessarily any action. The cantata for the Queen, I suppose, you have the different goddesses praising her various attributes, but in terms of drama, strictly speaking, it's not on the same scale as Preise dein Glücke, for example.
And it may be he just put that wording on as a sort of conventional thing, so it may not have all that much significance, but it is also interesting that he was using those words.
That's one of the big unanswered questions of music history. What would have happened if Bach had got a job at an opera house, or would he have even wanted one? He certainly put a lot of operatic style into his cantatas at times.
I really hope your performances go well, and
thank you.
You have a fantastic tour.
No, that's what I wanted to say. That we will be doing our best to bring these performances to life. As I said, all of the singers have memorized what they're going to sing, and we traditionally stand in front of the orchestra. So even at times in a sacred setting, we'll be doing our best to bring out the action of each piece, as we always try to do. Stephen, thank you so much for your time. It's been really fascinating to learn even more about these pieces, and we can't wait to dig into them next week and perform them to some people.
Thanks, Stephen. Your book sounds fascinating as well.
Thank you, and I hope it goes really well in your rehearsals and performances.
Thanks so much. Thank you for listening to the first episode of our SKaffeehaus podcast, and congratulations for making it all the way to the end. You must be a really hardcore fan. And if you are, please spread the word, subscribe, and you can even go onto our website and support us if you want to encourage us to do more. Take care.